Please welcome Dr. Karen Pierce.
Well, thank you so much, Toby, for inviting me to speak about my research today. I have been doing eye tracking research for a very long time, well over a decade. And across that span of time, we've eye tracked over 2,836 toddlers. And you can see here in this histogram, a pretty wide age range. We generally start at 12 months, but we go up to about 4 years in age with a modal age of 14 months. And we eye track toddlers spanning a range of ability and disability. We work with children with not only autism spectrum disorder, but when you're trying to understand what are the unique features of eye gaze patterns in autism, it's really important to have contrast groups. So we work with children with not only autism spectrum disorder, but also global developmental delay, language delay, autism features. So children have signs of autism, but not quite enough to get the diagnosis, other delays like motor delay, as well as children who are typically developing. So lots of data, lots of subjects in our research studies. So today what I'm going to do is first just talk to you really briefly about strategies that we've developed to enhance the quality of data from toddlers who can sometimes be a little fussy and a little bit unsure about what to do. And then what I'm going to spend most of my time talking about is my passion, which is autism and kind of our autism biomarker research agenda, and eye tracking kind of is at the center of that mission. So, okay, best practices for working with toddlers. The first thing that's really important, not just for toddlers, but for anybody doing eye tracking research, is you want to have standardized parent instruction because you don't want anything that the parent might do to impact the child's behavior. So one thing that's really important is you don't want the eye tracker to accidentally pick up the parent's eyes. Because we're working with such young children, the toddlers generally will sit on their parent's lap. And so we will read parents standardized instructions ahead of time, letting them know what the experiment's about. But most importantly, please look at this dot, which is up on the top of the wall. And here's a picture of our lab. You can see the little black dot, and parents are instructed to look up. And here's a picture of a mom looking up during the experiment. You want to have standardized lighting, seating, but also we found what's pretty important if you can do this is to have side barrier walls because you don't want any visual distractions for the toddler. So we have had this built for our center to optimize eye tracking where there are these two walls on either side of the child while they're doing eye tracking. Obviously, you'd like to build some rapport with the toddler. Sometimes we'll have little snacks ready, and if the toddler is sitting, as soon as the toddler is sitting nicely, you can give them a reward for sitting nicely. So you want to reinforce on-task behavior, but obviously not reinforce anything related to the actual experiment. You want to have a rapid calibration, so you manually move the calibration image across the screen. So you want to do that faster is better. Obviously, for research purposes, what we found is really important is you want to standardize your data by having a pretrial central fixation because you don't want some toddlers to be looking in different places when the experiment starts. You want to standardize where all the babies and all the toddlers are looking when it starts. So we always just have a flashing central stimulus before every one of our experiments so that all the kids are looking forward. And if a child never actually foveates on the central stimulus, then we don't use that data. And then in between experiments, we'll often do a validation probe, which essentially looks like a calibration where we display images in known locations, and then we check to see if there's been any drift or any, kind of drift across time with the actual hardware, with the Tobii hardware. So that's always really nice to do. Okay, so what is autism? Autism is a developmental disorder characterized by challenges in both perceiving social information and initiating social behavior. A lot of children with autism actually have really great cognitive skills and they really have a lot of competencies, but it's the social world that really is hard for them. And a lot of people have hypothesized it's because their social attention patterns are not often accurate. They might be looking, at a little crack in the wall instead of at someone's face. So imagine spending all of that time looking at the wrong place at the wrong time. You're missing a ton of social information. And, given experience-dependent mechanisms that are very important for how the brain develops, these kids are missing visual input time and time again. So that's why eye tracking is great. Also, children with autism have restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests. So they might have a motor behavior in their using their body, but their restricted interests and repetitive interests might just be what they're interested in, like cars or maps. But what's also really important about autism is it begins in the womb. It begins around the second trimester. So the biology begins to go awry before the child's even born. So this is really important. I'll get to that, why eye tracking is so great, because you can use it at any age. I mean, visual acuity isn't perfect, at birth and very young ages, but really eye tracking you can use quite well. We use it at 12 months, but we're going to start going down younger. And it doesn't matter if you can talk and what your functioning level is. It's a great tool for the youngest ages. And also it's fast. You can get a valid and reliable index of social attention in less than 2 minutes. So you probably have heard that autism is in the news all the time. It's a fairly common childhood disorder. At this point, the rates are 1 in 54 children, and they continue to go up. It's 20% higher than it was in 2014 when it was 1 in 68. It's 63% higher than in 2008, 104% higher than in 2006. And when I started in the field, it was only 1 in 150. So it's 177% higher than that time period. But the most important thing that this paper that was reported by the Centers for Disease Control notes is that the median age of first diagnosis was not until 51 months. And recall that I had mentioned to you that autism begins during prenatal life. So why are we, if you're not diagnosing a child until they're 3, 4, or 5, that means they're not going to start their treatment until they're 3, 4, or 5, but that's way too late. We'd love to get in there as early as possible, start doing some, positive behavioral therapy sessions and get those connections in that child's brain on track. And so we need a way to find children at super young ages that's really valid and accurate. So we've been using eye tracking as a potential biomarker discovery tool to see if there are specific patterns of eye gaze that are unique to autism that you don't find in kids who have these other delays and disorders. And maybe one day that can help guide pediatricians or other medical professionals to detect when a child is at risk for autism at super young ages when it's very hard for a clinician to figure that out. Again, plasticity is much higher during infancy than it is later. So the earlier is the better, and that's a big mission of our center. We know that babies are born socially interested. This is a landmark study that was initially presented by Gordon in 1975, replicated by Johnson in 1991. A baby is born, and the baby is literally just a few minutes old, and a researcher comes into the birth room with a paddle, right? And one paddle has like a face on it, another one has a scrambled face, and another one is blank. And the researcher goes like this and like moves the paddle around, and they film the baby's face and they see which one the baby tracks. From 9 minutes in age, the infants prefer the face over the non-face. So this is famous. Everyone's probably heard of this experiment. Researchers like Ferroni and colleagues in 2013 checked to see, is the brain differentially engaged to social images versus non-social images, and using functional NIRS. Here you see an infant with FNIRS headgear during a dynamic social condition where an infant is seeing a movie with a female actress making actions. We're seeing activation in temporal cortex, but you don't see activation in response to non-social images in that same region. So the brain, we're ready to interact from birth. Our brains are ready to intersocially interact from birth. So here I'm going to start jumping into my data. So, okay, we know that children with autism have issues or difficulties in figuring out where to attend. We know they like repetitive information. So, a classic infant development tool or paradigm is what's called a preferential looking paradigm, where you show an infant a stimulus and they have the choice to look at one thing or another, right? We can't look at two things at once, right? So here in what I call the geometric preference test for autism, it's a 1-minute movie. And the child, is just sitting down in their mom's lap. And this is data from a typically developing 14-month-old. I'm going to show you the movie. And obviously the red dot is where the child is looking. And if the red dot increases in size, that means that they're fixating in that same exact location for a longer period of time. And again, this is data from a typical toddler. And you can see that he's checks both sides of the screen, but he eventually decides that he is interested in the children in motion. And the reason I have these children kind of moving around is I wanted to kind of match the repetitive geometric shapes. I wanted to have motion on both sides. So if you want to be technical about it, they're doing yoga. So we've got yoga and we've got some moving shapes here. And that's a typically developing child. And now here's a toddler with that we know has ASD at 15 months. And check to see if you can figure out how his eye gaze patterns are different from the typical toddler you just saw. Kind of starts out looking similar. You can see a lot of staring because there's a very large red dot. He was mesmerized. he loved this side with repetitive geometric shapes. And so we were super excited by this data. But you might be thinking there in the audience, well, that was just one subject. What does that mean? So I'm going to show you a larger data set. So this is data from 917 toddlers who have participated in what we call the geometric preference test for autism. Here, the way we have our data organized, because it's a preferential looking paradigm, we have fixation on geometric images on the left side here on this y-axis, and then we have fixation on social images on this side because they have to add to 100. So for example, if you have a child who looked at the geometric images 98% of the time, you can look over here and know that, oh, they looked on the social images 2% of the time because every child needs to add up to 100%. And we first started publishing about this study in 2011, or about this paradigm in 2011 in JAMA Psychiatry, then a larger sample in biological psychiatry, and now we actually have a bigger study with more than that. We actually have around 2,000 toddlers at this point to kind of show what's going on with this geometric preference test for autism. So what's interesting is if you draw a line at 69% fixation on these geometric images, what do you notice? We have a total sample size of 917 kids. So the majority of children that are looking at the geometric images more than 69% of the time are ASD. And so if you draw the threshold there, we've got 61 true positives. But if you collapse across all of the hundreds of other kids, the 648 kids in these other contrast groups, there's only 14 children, and most of them actually have delays. If you look, there's only 3 toddlers who were truly typically developing that quote unquote failed the geometric preference test for autism. So what this shows us is that sensitivity is modest, right? It's only capturing, if you want to talk about a biomarker test, it's only finding about 23% of children who truly have ASD. So it's not catching everybody. But if you want to think about the good news about all this is that look at all these kids with autism down here. They're doing great. They're doing just as well as everybody else. They have this social interest. So if we were to make predictions, we might predict that the children who are focusing on the social images at an appropriate amount of time, they may have the best prognosis. So not only can we potentially determine who has autism using this, but we might be able to figure out prognostic information as well. So specificity is quite high because there are very few false positives. So sensitivity is modest, specificity is really high. But this data kind of highlights the fact that autism is a very heterogeneous disorder. There are lots of different people who have autism, and some end up going to college, and some individuals struggle to even talk. And so what I like about eye tracking is it helps us understand the heterogeneity of autism that can then feed into genetic studies, because we know that autism is strongly heritable and strongly genetic. So we need to figure out what the genes are relating to autism. And once we figure out subgroups and subtypes, this may guide those searches. And when we look at the clinical symptoms associated with the children that don't do particularly well on the geometric preference test, right? Those children that are looking at the geometric shapes 98% of the time, I've coded them here in red, the kids who have the high levels, as in comparison to the kids who actually didn't look much at the geometric images, but instead looked at the social images. We find that there's increased symptom severity. Here, this is data from a test called the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, and it basically helps give a clinician an idea of the severity of autism symptoms, and a higher score is worse on this particular test. So children who looked at the geometric images had higher symptoms in comparison to the kids who didn't do that. And you also see the same thing when you look at language ability. So here on this scale, language levels, a lower score means your language level is worse, and the children who didn't perform well in the eye tracking are in red. You can see that they had lower scores relative to the other kids. So we've done several what we call visual attention experiments, not just using the geometric pref test, but several other tests that we have developed. But as I mentioned, autism is very heterogeneous. And the cool thing about eye tracking is you can also not only tap into visual information, but auditory as well. You might be thinking, well, that doesn't make that much sense because it's a visual tool. But you can actually use gaze contingent technology where wherever a child looks on a screen, if they look at a particular XY coordinate, that can trigger an auditory file. So we started getting the idea, let's use eye tracking to understand auditory preferences in autism as well, so we can kind of pair that up with the visual preferences. So most children love mothery, so it's kind of like that sing-songy voice. And research has shown that children with autism don't pay as much attention to motherese speech sounds as typically developing toddlers. Here's a study by Kuhl and colleagues in 2005 that basically showed that 70% of children with autism preferred to listen to computer-generated sounds rather than this motherese voice. Children with autism are very well known for showing reduced levels of orienting to their name. So you can call their name, Johnny, Johnny, and sometimes they may not pay attention. Typically kids sometimes will blow you off too, but there's a slightly higher percentage for children with autism. And then we also know from brain imaging literature, particularly from research in our lab with Eric Crushane and Lisa Eiler and Michael Lombardo, that here we have a brain image, and here is kind of, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the area that kind of looks yellow and fiery, those are the brain regions that were active. We do natural sleep imaging in our lab, and so here are some toddlers, and these are typical toddlers with autism who have good language, and toddlers with autism who don't have particularly good language. You can see differences in levels of brain activity in the left superior temporal gyrus. So we know that there are deficits early in life, both behaviorally as well as how the brain is responding to social auditory information. And again, the characteristics of motherese speech is higher pitch, slower tempo, heightened positive affect, like, I love you, sweetie, exaggerated speech contours, high rates of questions, lots of good reasons for mom to do this because it stimulates your baby's attention, learning, and the special type of attention called joint attention, where the baby and the mother focus on an external object, and they kind of have this triangle of attention. And research studies have shown that it improves language acquisition and engagement and reactivity. So there are lots of studies that basically show that babies love this, and from the first minutes of life, they're attending to this motherese speech. So what we've done with our eye tracking is we have created 3 motherese paradigms using gaze contingent technology, where basically we interface Tobii technology with E', and wherever the baby looks triggers a particular sound file. And so our first experiment, we have what we call a motherese versus highway noises. So a baby watches a video very similar to the GeoPref test, but here on this occasion where the baby looks will trigger a different sound file. If they look over here, they'll hear this mom saying all cute things about these little kittens. And then if they look over here, they'll hear beep, 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 they'll hear the highway. This is another experiment where if they look over here, they'll hear the mom talking. On the left-hand side, they'll hear just kind of these sounds, kind of musical data streams. And in our last experiment, we tried to control for the visual environment and just have the sound be different. So we have this mother doing the exact same actions with this dinosaur, but in one condition she's speaking in motherese, and in another condition she's speaking in flat affect. And so here's what this paradigm looks like. This is a typically developing toddler in our first gaze contingent motherese paradigm. The red dot again shows you where the toddler is looking, but in this case, what audio file they're hearing. Oops, and let me try to, hopefully you can hear this.
Ginger and Coco go night-night in my beddy. They love my blankie. They're so cute. They purr and purr. And then Ginger wakes up and jumps on my head.
And now here's a toddler with autism spectrum disorder at 18 months, and you can see what his preference was for auditory stimuli.
Sweetie, have you met Ginger and Coco?
So it's interesting because it's kind of like the GeoPref test. It's very similar to what we find in the visual domain, that there's a subset of kids who don't attend to the motherese, which is, seems to be very innately driven to attend to that, but instead they're interested in these highway noises. So here I plotted the scatter plot, the opposite that we plotted with our visual data. In this case, the sort of positive attention to motherese is here on the y-axis. And in the ASD cases, a lot of children did just like the other kids. They're doing great. They're doing high levels of motherese fixation. But again, we're finding this subset of kids here on the bottom. 52 toddlers with ASD did not prefer motherese, so they listened to it less than half the time, whereas only 6 typically developing toddlers did this. If you convert this into sensitivity and specificity, the rates are very similar to what we got for the GeoPref test. So we're finding these subtypes, and so it's really interesting about what you can kind of do with eye tracking. And here's data from the second eye tracking experiment where One side triggers motherese, another side triggers music, and the data looks very similar. We have 2 typically developing toddlers here shown in the blue dots that did not prefer the motherese versus 40 toddlers with ASD that did not prefer the motherese. The sensitivity and specificity values are very similar to the other experiment. And so what I want to show you next is an experiment that actually didn't work and didn't generate great data for us, but actually I guess it did, because sometimes when things don't work out in science, you learn something from it. So here's our experiment where we pitted motherese speech against flat affect, and we thought that, you know, all the typical kids would really love the motherese and they would ignore this kind of flat affect one, and we'd find a big effect in autism.
He found some berries. Do you like berries? Berries are his favorite food. He runs very fast to eat the berries. Do you like berries? Berries are Rexy's favorite food. He sees the berries and he runs so fast to the berries and he gobbles.
Okay, so what ended up happening is the typical kids thought the flat affect was so funny that they ended up looking at that. And so we didn't find a difference, mainly because we had a lot of typical kids who thought that was funny and looked at the flat affect. So this was not a huge success in terms of having any sensitivity or specificity. And here's an AUC curve, and P was 0.07 and confidence interval wasn't great. So yeah, that's the interesting thing about typical toddlers. You know, novelty is a big thing for them too. So you have to take that into consideration when you're developing your paradigms, but it was a good try. And again, here, this is just the data that I was talking with you about, this similar density of kids who liked the flat affect. So the last thing I just kind of want to touch on is how we're a multimodal kind of research laboratory. So we don't only do eye tracking, we have a lot of clinical phenotyping and brain imaging. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we do what's called sleep imaging. Right? If anyone out there has gotten an MRI, you know it's very noisy, and you can't easily put a 2-year-old or a 1-year-old in an MRI scanner and hope you're going to get any interesting data. But what you can do is you can bring the babies down to the scanner after they're really tired, like an hour past their bedtime, and put them into the scanner, obviously with appropriate protective gear, and we put headphones on and we pipe in little stories while the babies are asleep to check to see kind of functional networks in the baby's brain while they're sleeping, but also listening to stories. And then we check to see how that relates to our eye tracking data, among other things. And so here is, this just kind of shows you some really famous resting state networks. So Marcus Raichle was one of the first people to kind of highlight the idea that there are these brain regions that have neurons that fire synchronously. So these networks are always active, even during rest. Even if you're in a coma, you've got these functional networks. There are a lot of them. People have discovered dozens and dozens of them, but kind of the most famous one is probably the default mode network, because it's brain regions that are related to social processing. And again, we're all about autism. We want to understand why there's so many challenges for kids with autism about social processing. So what we wanted to do is see how the default mode network kind of talks to, or what the correlation is with visual information, right? Because with eye tracking, there's visual attention, but we know that they have social issues. So we thought, let's just see if the default mode network is talking to the visual network. So we kind of are looking for relationships between the default mode and the visual mode. And here is data that basically shows connectivity levels between the social brain areas and the visual brain areas for children with autism who are in various levels of ability and disability using eye tracking, and contrast to other groups. So here on the y-axis, you're just seeing connectivity between the brain regions. And here we just plotted it as ASD non-social preference. That's basically the children who looked at the geometric shapes. And you can see that connectivity between the default mode and the visual mode is lower than for these other groups, even in comparison to children with autism who liked the social images. They had higher connectivity. So we're kind of seeing this relationship between the way the brain is acting, and it's bearing out in what the children are looking at when they're doing our eye tracking experiments. And this was a significant difference between several of these groups. So what I just want to say in conclusion here, this is coming down to the end of my presentation. I just want to bring out some summary points, is that, you know, we are using eye tracking to develop biomarkers of ASD. And the reason we do it is because we think that it's going to help reduce the age of diagnosis, of first diagnosis, to between 12 to 28 months. And we think that one day it might actually be a great diagnostic tool, because we want every child to have kind of the best start in life to get their early treatment. But also what we found is that children who show the most extreme abnormalities in visual attention patterns have the worst symptom severity and the lowest kind of language and cognitive abilities, because we think that unusual visual preference, may interfere with how the brain is wiring itself up during early development, as we kind of saw with the brain imaging experiment that I briefly showed you. And we know that experience-dependent mechanisms is probably why these children are having some issues, because they're not getting the right experience during these early developmental periods. So we predict poor prognosis, and we do have some data to suggest that that is true. I just didn't have time to show it for you today. And we think that we may be able to help develop treatments one day based on each child's specific patterns of eye gaze, and maybe even one day a marker of treatment response. So you might be able to do a battery of eye gaze patterns, have a child engage in treatment, and then do your eye gaze battery again and see if maybe we're able to kind of change how the child visually examines things. So I want to thank all the thousands of families who've participated. And in a quick plug, if any postdocs are out there, we just got some new funding. We'd love to have you come to San Diego, so please contact me. Thank you to Eric Crochane, who's the co-director of our center. And we've got a big team working with us locally as well as international collaborators. So thank you so much.